Hello there. Welcome to Syntax. In today's live stream, I am going to be answering any code questions that you might have. So if you have them, throw them in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer them and also show some code examples if I can. And we're live on YouTube. We're live on Twitch. Let me tell you about some things, and then we'll get right into it. So here we are. Here. Great. First up, we just reached 30,000 followers over on Instagram. So because of that, we are having a giveaway. So definitely check out this post over on Instagram because all you got to do is follow, comment, and tag someone, and you can be entered to win a t-shirt, a drink koozie, and a skateboard. So definitely follow over on Instagram if you have not. But welcome in. I see a lot of cool people, see a lot of familiar names in the chat. I will clarify, this is just me in the live stream. I'm just answering code questions here. Scott or Wes won't be here. It's just going to be me. Yeah, so there's that. And let's just say hey to all the people, and then we'll get right into it. So what's up, Carlos? Good to see you. I was testing out my chat overlay earlier, so I have this this lorem ipsum. So that's probably why they just said okay. Yeah. Was this timing a mistake? No, just technical difficulties. Yeah, I'm 45 minutes late, and I apologize. But what's up, Pranjal? Good to see you. And we have a couple questions. What's up, Andrew? Good to see you as well. Yes. And Nico, good to see you too. Welcome in. Let's get to some of the questions. One of the first questions that was asked was on Twitter, actually. And actually, before we get into the questions, let's just talk about recent news, because this was super interesting, and I'd like to know your thoughts on it as well. So Node.js has added experimental strip types as a feature flag in their nightly release. And what this allows you to do is to run TypeScript code. So first, it will just strip away all of the types and then run the code as JavaScript through Node.js. And this is different from a compiler or type checking, because it doesn't actually transpile your code. It literally just strips away the types. So it's actually pretty fast. And pretty soon you'll be able to use this in Node. Right now it's just an experimental feature. I think it's fascinating because we have things like Dino and Bun that you can both just point at a TypeScript file and run it without having to compile or transpile it first. And so this will be cool to have inside of Node. But because it is just type stripping, it is a subset of TypeScript, so it doesn't support enums or namespaces. So I imagine this is really just useful for like one-off scripts. Like every now and then I might want to write like a little TypeScript file and then just run it without having to set up like a TS config and all this stuff. And this will be possible with Node, which is pretty cool. I don't know. I'd be curious on your thoughts on it. Do you think this is a good thing? Will you use it? I definitely will. And if you want to try it out, they have I believe a code sandbox, or you can download the nightly release to try it out. But essentially, like any types that are defined, any type annotations, it just gets stripped away and it's able to run the code. So we're actually running this through Node.js with this -- experimental strip types using the latest nightly version of Node, and it can spit out the JavaScript code. So it's pretty cool. I thought that was interesting, and that I thought I would share. And also, Scott did a video on it this morning. So if you want to learn a little bit more, check out our YouTube channel. And watch Scott's video. Here, check it out.
Something absolutely
cool. And what's up, Mush? Good to see you. And what's up, Irasam? Yeah, good to see you over on the Twitch side as well. And thank you for those follows over on Twitch. Let's get into it. So like I said, the first question came from Twitter. And if you have any more questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I'll get to as many as I can, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can. But this first one comes from Bacon and Eggs over on Twitter. And they say, what's the best approach to upgrading Vue.js 2 project on Vue Bootstrap to Vue.js 3 with a new library given Vue Bootstrap has gone stale? Is a rewrite almost from scratch unavoidable? I have no idea, but let's look into it. So if you are unfamiliar, the change from Vue.js 2 to Vue.js 3, there were some breaking changes, but typically those breaking changes were for libraries. So I imagine like the library Vue Bootstrap would have had to have been completely rewritten or revamped to support version 3. Let's see. I saw something about Vue 3 in the search results. Let's see. Vue.js 3 initial support. So Bootstrap Vue meets Vue Compat. With the release of 2.23, you can now use Bootstrap Vue with the migration build of Vue.js 3. Fascinating. Okay, so this is a potential path forward. So a migration build, I believe, is like a specific version of Vue version 3 for people that are slowly upgrading to Vue version 3. So this would be a good solution, at least for now. Yeah, so that's one potential path. Okay. Okay, and then I'm curious, I feel like I have found a Vue Bootstrap for Vue 3. Like a different one, because this is the main one, Bootstrap Vue. Bootstrap Vue 3. So this is another library. It doesn't have any stars. So that looks like it's your main path forward is to use compat mode while you still can. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe you can look on GitHub as well to see what their release plan is for supporting version 3. Project stats and roadmap. This code will be deprecated in favor of code being developed here. Bootstrap Vue Next. Okay. This is also a potential solution. So this is an early but lovely implementation of Vue 3 and Bootstrap 5 and TypeScript. Let's see the docs. Yeah, I'd be curious how close the API is to the previous library. But if you're not doing anything too crazy, this probably could be a drop-in replacement. So this is another answer, is use this version, which I'm guessing they're saying it's early, but they still have quite a few components. So those are your two options. Use compat mode or use Bootstrap Vue Next. But thank you for your question, Bacon and Eggs. Appreciate that. All right, next question comes from Stefan in the Coding Garden Discord, and it is, what are your views on choice of programming language these days for web versus compiled, desktop client versus compiled server versus embedded systems? I mean, these days I'm still writing a lot of JavaScript. But I did recently do a video over on the Syntax channel about using .NET, and you can check that out over here. I did a C# for TypeScript devs. What's up, C? And I like I like C# and .NET and like the C# ecosystem, because they have like pretty much everything built in. Like the past few days, I've been working on building some stuff with Next.js, like the latest version of Next.js and Nextauth and a few other things. And there's a lot of code, and it's very, I have to piece a lot of things from a lot of different docs, whereas like in the C# and .NET world, everything is just like in the Microsoft docs. So C# is pretty cool. If I were building like a decoupled application, because I would still want to build a front end with like React or Vue, I might create just like a JSON API with C#. That would be one of my choices. And then I've explored Rust, but I haven't written a lot of Rust. And then if you're building a desktop app, I probably would still reach for Electron. I know there are things like Tari, which allow you to build desktop apps with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but it's a smaller bundle size and potentially faster than something like Electron. It's not as bloated. But I tried using it probably over a year ago, and the main thing I didn't like about it is because it's based on top of Rust, the entire like file system API and all of the stuff for doing native things, you're still writing JavaScript to do it, but it's using like some sort of Rust bridge. So you don't use like the FS library from Node.js. There's like a specific library that you use. Like here, they have their own FS library that has its own methods, which last time I used it were not the same as the Node.js one. So that was a little bit cumbersome because you're basically learning like a brand new API, even though you're still writing in TypeScript. But Tari would be a good choice as well. And then I don't know if it's still a thing, but there was this thing called like Proton Native, which was like React Native, but for desktop. Yes, let's look at their GitHub. Are they still going? Like 10,000 stars? The last commit was 3 years ago, though. So this may not be completely up to date. But yeah, I don't know. Depending on what I'm trying to do, I probably would still just use Electron because it's so easy and I'm so used to it. So yeah, hope that helps. Feel free to answer in the chat if you have any opinions on what can be used for these kinds of things. But yeah, someone had asked about the hats in the chat, and Scott's in the chat. So hello, Scott. Thanks for being here. Yeah, Billy Jacoby asks, where did the hats go that I saw in the merch store? I don't think they're for sale yet. Yeah. So you might have seen the tweet that Wes Boss posted, and some hats were going to production, but I don't think they're in the store just yet. Yeah. What's up, TY2K? This is probably only the third live stream that I've done since I started at Syntax, but I'd like to do more. I'd like to do more of these. Yeah. Yeah, but I'm excited. Let me see if I can find the tweet, because I am excited about those hats as well. I want one of the wool ones. Actually, let's check out Wes Boss. Let's see. I believe he posted an image too. Yeah, these are going to be sick when they come out. I can't wait to get one of these. But yeah, they're not in the store just yet. But speaking of the store, we do have other stuff for sale. So first of all, if you're just joining us, check out our Instagram. We have a giveaway because we reached 30,000 followers. You could get this stuff for free, or you could also just go to the shop. So if you go to Sentry.shop, we've got the Blazing Fast NASCAR shirt. We've got collabs with Drizzle and Prettier. So when you buy either one of these shirts, $10 goes to the maintainers of both those libraries. We've also got the Sick Pick, which is what I'm wearing right now. And the other things that you saw as well. So if you look at all the stuff, we've also got the Pocket Tee, the skateboard, the Panther Tee, and the koozie. So definitely check out the shop. Yeah. Yeah, what's up, Arvind? Glad you could hang out. Nice to see someone talk cool things other than just my office code. Yeah, I also want this to be a bit of a hangout as well, so feel free to just let me know what's on your mind. Yeah, so Scott is mentioning that there's another hat. It's like a dark blue one. That one's pretty sick too. Yeah. Definitely. All right, let's keep going. We had some more questions. This next one was on YouTube, so I'll use my little highlight thingy. Let's see. Yeah, so George Baroa asks, from your Coolify tutorial, you mentioned that Coolify isn't something you are willing to use for production. What would an ideal workflow look like without a UI like Coolify? I sort of, in a way, it's what I set up in the YouTube video I did talking about how to set up Caddy. So if we take a look at that, I guess if you look at playlists, there is a Self-Host 101 playlist, and I believe it's the third video in this playlist. So I show up how I set up Caddy from scratch, like on a Linux server. So I would start there, like just have Caddy as the basis. But then if you're using that in combination with Docker, there is a Caddy Docker proxy, which is what Coolify actually uses under the hood. So if you check out Caddy Docker proxy, and then I talk about this in my Coolify video. So if you check out my Coolify crash course, I talk about how Coolify is using this and basically show you how you can configure Coolify to further customize how Caddy is integrated with it. But basically what this allows you to do is you can have Docker containers running, but if you set some tags, or sorry, some labels on your containers, this will automatically create the reverse proxies inside of Caddy. So you don't have to maintain separate configuration. So basically, every project you have that's based on Docker, you would create a compose file, add in your labels that describe like what's the domain and what port are you proxying to, And as long as caddy docker proxy is running in the background, it'll automatically create those caddy configs. So caddy in combination with this will get you pretty far. Now, this is for things just running on a single server, and that's what I have most experience with. Is I'm running sites on a server with a decent amount of resources and not necessarily like scaling to multiple, because beyond that, you probably want to get into some sort of like orchestration tool, which I don't have as much experience with. But for me, being able to just set up my Docker Compose, have caddy running in the background, this is mainly what you need. And then from there, you could also use Docker to run your databases or any other types of services that you need. The nice thing about Coolify is it has like a nice GUI for creating backups and stuff like that. If you wanted to create backups manually and you're doing everything without a UI, you would really just have to create like a cron job, have some sort of script that does like a database dump, and then upload that to some like S3 bucket or something like that. So it's a lot more manual. But for the small sites that I'm running, I'm more willing to just use these tools that I know than try to figure out how to do it exactly inside the Coolify UI. I don't know. I might get to a point where I just use Coolify. I know that Scott uses Coolify for most things. I'm just so stuck in my ways of like using the CLI and stuff like that. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I see. So I think there was an issue. I think we created the listing, but they're not ready to sell yet. You got a sneak peek. Very nice. Yeah. Yeah, I guess traffic is also another option. So like if so traffic would be a replacement or alternative to caddy. But what's nice about traffic is they have a web dashboard. So if you look at traffic proxy specifically, you can install this on your server, and then they have a web UI. Let me see if I can get a screenshot here. Yeah, it looks like this. So you get a web UI of all the services that you have running. So that's pretty cool about traffic. I find traffic a bit more involved to configure than caddy. Caddy's like simple configuration style is like the best I've seen. Just makes things so easy and removes all of, like the boilerplate and stuff. Traffic is a little more involved, but they do have a little web dashboard here. And I looked for like a caddy UI dashboard. I think I found some people that were trying to build something. Yeah, so this is caddy UI, so it's a UI for the caddy proxy, but it's pretty old. It hasn't been updated in 3 years, so I'm not sure if it still works like with the latest version. I thought about building my own too, but that is one of the nice things about traffic. Yeah. How is my home lab set up? Non-existent. I get so busy with other things, I stopped working on it. I want to get back to it though. There's some just like home lab, or is it not home lab? There's a thing for home automation. I forget what it's called. I want to run that locally. Yeah, cool. But yeah, thank you for your question. And I will say, if you're interested more in like how to do this stuff in production in terms of like continuous integration and continuous deployment and some of the things that you would get with something like Coolify, if you check out this office hours that I did in the Self-Host 101 series, both this video and the other office hours video, I talk about basically how we can do more things to make our server that is just where we're just managing everything from the CLI, make it a bit more robust and give us more features that we are used to and stuff like Vercel or even like in a Coolify dashboard. So definitely check out those two office hours as well, because I answer quite a few more questions. Cool. All right, let's see. I'm going to answer a question from Twitch. I'm going to try to. Oh, nice. Front-end Fiend over on Twitch is saying, wearing my Webmaster t-shirt right now. Yeah, they're sold out in the store, but I think at some point we're going to probably print some more. If you never saw it, this one. This one. It's awesome. But they're wearing it right now. That's awesome. Okay, so Hex EXE says, I'm a full stack developer. I use a Vue.js and Laravel combo mostly. I've been searching for a boilerplate for my Vue applications. I need some basic things like authentication, routing, caching, and data fetching configured and ready to use. I've tried creating a template repo, but it gets old by the time between my projects. What would you recommend? I have never used a boilerplate for Vue apps because the Vue CLI does everything I need. I get what you're saying though, because you probably have like a base set of configurations and stuff that you do in your projects, like configuring, like you said, routing and different things like that. Yeah. Does anybody in the chat know? I know there are specific CLI tools that help with creating like template repos. It might, I don't know if it's an external thing, but like if you look at the Create Vite CLI tool, it's actually pulling in templates and cloning them locally to your computer. But I'm curious if it's using a library to do that, and that could potentially be the basis for like creating your own. Let's see if anybody in the chat has anything. Yeah, why are we so addicted to boilerplates these days? Listen, it makes the job easier. It makes at least the start of the job makes a whole lot easier. Yeah, and what's up, Pat? Who says, I'm a big fan from Thailand. I would like to say thank you to your setup MacBook 2024 video. I got lots of fantastic libraries. Nice, glad to hear it. Yeah, that people are still watching that video. I'm very surprised how well that one did. But let's actually look at Create Vite and look at their dependencies and see what they are doing. Because, so, back in the day, we used to use this thing called Yowman, or Yoman. Project Scaffold. I think people still use this technically, but it's definitely not used as much. Like you can create your own generators, and you can see what generators people have here. So this is like a Spring Boot Angular generator, and they have a whole configuration system for defining your own generators. But let's see if we look at Create Vite. See, so it has a folder. It has all these possible templates. It might be as simple as just literally cloning a template into your project whenever you generate it. But there are some tools that can like ask you questions and then generate the project accordingly. Let's look at their package.json. They have prompts, minimist. What does this do? Yo, man, yeah. Parsing arguments, yep. And then I'm guessing prompts is probably a similar thing. So yeah, I would imagine they're literally just cloning these repos into your folder. Let's look at their codes. Dist index.js source index. Create a new Vite project. You answer a question. And I'm guessing it's just a git clone. Make a directory. Write the files, but how did we get the files? Read the template directory. Is it writing one file at a time from the main repo? Fascinating. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I don't have a good answer for you. If we're back at the question that got answered on Twitch, which is basically how to create a boilerplate for like a Vue related application. Really just create the base template and then clone from there. I mean, one of the tools that I use is npm upgrade. So this is this the one I use? I think, or is it check updates? I was using this one for a long time. And then let me just look at my CLI. npm check updates is what I use. Yeah. And so there are automated tools for this. So if you have a repo that's like your base template, you could add Dependabot, and it could automatically upgrade your dependencies, at least for the ones that are not breaking changes. But for some of the templates I have for like Express APIs, I just do this manually. I mean, I probably should set up some sort of automation, but if you look, I have 2 starter templates for creating Express apps. I've got the Express API starter and the Express API starter TypeScript. But these are literally just Git repos. And every month or so, I'll go in, use that tool to update the dependencies. And that's really all they need to stay up to date. They don't have a ton of dependencies, but this at least keeps them up to date here. And then when people want to use this, they literally just clone this repo. So if you look at the CLI tool that I use to generate these apps, it just uses a tool called dgit. And so dgit is a command line tool that will, given a Git repo, it'll clone it, remove all of the Git history, and then just give you that base repo. So you can use dgit pointed at any repo, and it just gives you that repo without all the commit history. And so that's used for both the Express API Starter and the Express API Starter TS. I have a little command line tool that just wraps dgit to pull either of these, depending on if you want TypeScript or not. And then I have a React starter template for with Vite and a few other things. And one of the things you can do on GitHub is you can mark your repo as a template. And once you do that, anybody that comes across your repo can use this button that says use as a template. And that will basically clone this repo to a new repo without all the Git commit history. And then they have all of your base project. But yeah. So yeah, no good answers there, just manually. And yeah, I don't have a good answer for you. All right, let's jump back to the YouTube chat and get some answers from there. Yeah. All right. Question from Paolo. Please restock the 3X of the latest t-shirt. I know this is not a question, but please do it. I don't know. Maybe if Scott is listening and he knows anything, maybe I have no idea. I think a lot of this stuff, we did one run of it. So I think printing any more would require a new run. I have no idea if we have any plans for that. I think that was actually, no. If I remember right, we didn't have any 3XL, but for whatever reason, it's listed in the store, but we actually didn't have any. We only got up to 2XL. All right, this next one comes from Ahmed, who says, you were using the browser to present the question asked on X in your local host. Can we know how to do that? I'll show you the code. So it's just a little Git repo. Well, it's an Astro app. Of course, it's a Git repo. It's an Astro app where I just added a bunch of custom styles. And I'll show you what they're talking about. If we look back on YouTube, and specifically one of the office hours videos that I did, I think like this one, maybe. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hello. Yeah, it's this. So you can see as I'm asking the questions, I can like use the arrow keys and the questions appear on the screen, and it's nice and like branded. It looks like syntax. Cool, but let me see if I can find that repo really quick. Give me just a moment. But for this, I actually used the Scroll Snap API. So I talked about the Scroll Snap API in my CSS video. And I think Wes and Scott talked about it in the recent podcast episode too. But you can do scroll snapping, which basically gives you like slideshow like effects in with CSS. Yeah, here it is. So it's just a little Astro app, and then I wrote some code that would pull in all the comments for a given video from YouTube, and then allow me to go and check the ones that I wanted, and then it exported that as JSON, and then I put the JSON file into this app, which just iterates over them. It was a pretty manual process, but I was okay with it. But you can see here, if I press the arrow keys, these things slide in. And they're just little cards that I designed with CSS. And then I have I'm using intersection observer to see when it comes into view, the animation plays it into view. And but they are literally just copy pasted from the YouTube comments themselves. But yeah, let me see if I can dig into the code for you. So I have this comment component, and I built it with Svelte. But yeah, we have this intersection observer. So anytime something comes into view, we add the visible class name, and that animates it in and out. Let me see if I have the CSS in this file, or is it elsewhere? Yeah. This is just a CSS transform. So rotate it and then translate it back onto the page. And I believe the default style for the element is to be off the page. So when the visible class gets added to it, it animates on, and then when it gets removed, it gets animated off, because the default style is to be translated like 200 pixels off the screen. And so that just happens with the intersection observer. When it comes into view, add the class, it animates in. And then after that, it's just CSS. Like I have a div called user, and then I believe I have a class for like images inside the user class, and it just styles their avatar, and then also styles their username. And I did some special things, like sometimes there would be like section headers, or sometimes I wanted to display multiple of them, so I had like a nested array of comments. Like, yeah, and then like I wanted title sections. I don't know. The code was all very manual, and I did it in the morning before I made that video because I wanted like a nicer presentation for it. But it's just some pretty basic CSS. But yeah, thank you for your question, Ahmed. Cool. Paolo's talking about the 3XL shirts. Yeah. Paolo says, I was eagerly awaiting the 3X. Yeah, if I am correct, we actually did not print any 3XL. But would I do some tutorial video on Astro? I'd be down to do it. So right now I'm working on a full stack tutorial where I build something from start to finish. That's going to be posted to the syntax channel. And I'm doing that with Next.js. But it could be cool to do a similar thing with Astro. The Next.js one's going to be really involved though, like very long. There's a lot of stuff to make a production ready full stack app. But it could be cool to do some stuff with Astro as well. All right, let's answer a question from Twitch. Back over to Twitch. Cool. Akarin asks, hey, I've been trying to make an interactive map where I can drag and drop elements onto the map. I've tried using the HTML canvas or libraries like Leaflet. Do you know of any other ways? No, and I've never tried to do this. So I guess if we could describe what you're trying to build. You might have like a panel on one side and then the map itself. And like maybe these are like icons that you want to drag, like pins you want to drag onto the map. And then when you drag them, they appear, and then you can drag them from there. If I had to hand wave and talk about how to implement it, let's just take Leaflet.js, for example. Because basically once the thing gets dropped onto the map, I would no longer be writing my own custom code for this. I would leverage Leaflet itself, because if you look at Leaflet, they very likely have a, what is it called? A marker. And you can customize a marker to, instead of being the default marker, it can be an image. So you have the ability to actually set what's displayed. And so I would combine this with the drag and drop API, where your map is the drag target, and on drop, you get the mouse location or the XY location of where the drop happened, and then create a marker on the map. And then from there, a marker is already drag and droppable I believe if it's enabled, like, yeah, there's an option for draggable. So if you get what I'm saying, basically it goes from being just an image on the left-hand side, and then you make it a draggable thing, but then as you drag it, when you drop it, you're not actually dropping the image. Behind the scenes, you're creating a marker at the location where the drop happened. And then from that point, the map library takes over, and now it's just a marker that can be dragged, and you don't have any extra code for that. And I would integrate it the same way, even if you were using like Mapbox or something like that. So yeah, hopefully that helps. Let me know if you have more details on that. What's up, Ched? Welcome in. Good to see you. Yeah. Yeah, that was the one, front-end thing, npm check updates. Best deployment method for Vue and Laravel. I have no idea, but I do know that Laravel has in their docs, like they have a deployment partner, that like a service that they partner with that helps you to deploy that's like ready to go. Laravel Forge. Maybe it's their own thing. But yeah, it's called Laravel Forge. And as far as I know, a lot of people that use Laravel use this to deploy because it knows about your app. It knows how things are structured, and it's kind of configured for it. What's up, Simonseer? Good to see you. Yeah. So yeah, Akron, that'd be the way to go. It's like, hopefully that helps. Yeah, and thank you, Super Secret Name. Thanks for the follow. What's up? It's been a while. Yeah. I remember you from Coding Garden. Welcome in. Cool. Let's get into some of the YouTube questions as well. Yeah, so and Nico mentioned it. It's Forge for Laravel. What's my favorite tech stack these days? I don't think I have one. I think I'm pretty jaded on tech stacks. Whatever requires the least amount of code is my favorite thing. Let's see what other questions we have, though. Yeah, so Pranjal has a question that I do not know how to answer. So they ask, how can I migrate my infrastructure from Docker Compose to K8s, which is Kubernetes? Can we reuse all those Docker Compose config files to generate the K8s config? My guess is there's probably something in the ecosystem that exists to convert it, or maybe Kubernetes can just use Docker Compose files. So there's a package or a library called Compose with a K. So it takes Docker Compose files and then deploys them as Kubernetes clusters. Fascinating. It has 9,000 stars. It was last contributed to a month ago. This looks like the way to go. Very cool. Yeah, try that out. But again, I don't have any experience with it, but it's Compose with a K. Yeah, and Akarin over on Twitch says, thanks, I'll try it out. Didn't think of using a marker like that. Yeah, that's how I would do it. Because I mean, otherwise you could, yeah, let's just go back to that question really quick, because there's some other ways to implement it. So this was Akarin's question about how to drag things onto a map. The other way is to have like a transparent overlay element on top of the map. And then you drag elements onto it. But then you somehow need to sync that with the map. And so that's where things would get really hard, because if a user is like panning on the map, you need to know the state of that. So like when a pan happens, and then you need to update your thing on the overlay accordingly. It sounds like a hot mess because you're trying to keep those two things in sync. But if you just let the map library do it, then it'll probably be easier to manage. Yeah. Cool. Welcome in that random dude who is super secret over on Twitch. Let's see, any other questions? Raul Springer is asking, can you explain the backend for frontend concept or pattern? I have never heard of it. So let's learn together. Backend for frontend pattern. Let's make an educated guess as to what this is. Maybe this is some kind of architecture for how you structure your like data access code, even though it is still client-side code or front-end code. And that would be my guess, is like basically you're architecting your code so that you're not making API requests like directly in your code base. Things are abstracted away so that way you're interfacing with this like data layer, and that in turn is talking to a REST API or whatever else. But let's see what it actually is. Microsoft has a document on it. There's a Medium post. The backends for frontends pattern. Create separate backend services to be consumed by specific front-end applications or interfaces. This pattern is useful when you want to avoid customizing a single backend for multiple interfaces. Okay, I was completely wrong. Initially, this is making me think of like API gateway, where you have multiple backends and then some kind of gateway that brings them all together that is in turn proxying requests to those various backends. So the context and the problem: an application may initially be targeted at a desktop web UI. Typically, a backend service is developed in parallel that provides the features needed for that UI. As the application's user base grows, a mobile application is developed that must interact with the same backend. The backend service becomes a general-purpose backend serving the requirements of both desktop and mobile. But the capabilities of a mobile device differ significantly. Sure. These differences result in competing requirements for the backend. The backend requires regular and significant changes to serve both desktop and web. Okay, so we're going to abstract out the common functionality to one backend service, and then your web will make requests to some kind of intermediary that is specific for web, but for all the generalized things go to the other service. Create one backend per user interface. Issues and considerations. Wait, never mind. It's not even that. It's literally just two backend services for different front ends. Huh. That sounds like a lot of extra code. And I guess maybe if you had some sort of like mono repo set up, you would bring like all of your shared types, shared data access into maybe like a shared library, and then both of these backends use that. But in my mind, you're going to have a lot of duplicated code between these two. So I would go one step further. I would have like a backend for my backend, and then everything that can be generalized lives there, and then anything specific to desktop or mobile will live on this service, but any requests that need to go here will travel via proxy through that service. Yeah. Fascinating. What else do we... Let's see if anybody says anything different about it, because that was what Microsoft said about backend for front end. Yeah, and this is kind of what I'm talking about. So like you would have these services that would be each type of app would be talking to you directly, but that in turn would still proxy some requests and services to services so that you don't have a lot of code duplication. Okay, what do I think about the pattern? I think it makes sense, but it's also possible to have just like a single code base where if you structure things in the right way and you have your endpoints structured in the right way, you can get away with still handling multiple front ends. And I think the other thing is you should flip the problem. Like your backend stays as a generalized data access and data and authentication and different things like that. And then your front ends have the custom logic that use that data in various ways, if that makes sense. Cool, but thank you for your question, Raul. All right, what else do we got? Cool, so Arvind has a question. Just the person I wanted to ask. Working for an MNC, this process is killing me. Code progression to prod takes 1 month. I'm continuously in a state of terror. Do you have a guide? What does the MNC abbreviation stand for? I mean, what you're describing sounds like a corporate environment. Multinational corporation, is that what it is? That's probably what it is, right? But my advice is there's not much you can do. I mean, so I worked at a multinational corporation, and every single app that was exposed over the web had to have a security analysis, and there were tons of checks and balances in place to prevent security incidents. And then beyond that, once an application is in production, there's a ton of checks and balances in place before updates can be made to make sure that those updates are also compliant. It's just the way things go. I think you could potentially have, I don't know, some kind of like local branch where maybe you're working further ahead than you can be on like the main branch. I guess my main advice is just accept it. Like, this is the way things are. So you're going to have to work within the confines of taking a while before your stuff actually gets pushed. Yeah, I would say don't be terrified. Maybe enjoy the fact that things aren't moving fast, because in other industries, like in startups and stuff like that, things move very fast. And for some people, that can lead to burnout. But what you're describing right now can also lead to burnout, which is crazy to think about. But like the lack of things to do and like just sitting around waiting can also lead to people burning out. But yeah, I don't have any good advice. If you have any advice in the chat, feel free to throw it in. But yeah, my advice is accept that is the way it is, and do your best to work within those constraints. Yeah. Hash says, y'all need to do an episode on site reliability engineering. All the stuff I know about DevOps and stuff like that, I just taught myself and kind of just did on the job because I needed to. I've never officially been like a site reliability engineer. It might be good to get someone as a guest on the podcast that's been a site reliability engineer or something like that. Yeah. All right. Duali has a question. What are some of your favorite React libraries or dev tools? What might be your go-tos when starting a new project? Let's think about it. So if I'm building a React client app that's talking to an API, I very likely am reaching for TanStack query. And the thing is, when you're building decoupled applications where you have like a separate REST API and then a separate single page application or client, most of what you're doing is interfacing with that API. And so what's nice about TanStack query is a lot of times you might not even need to reach for like a global state management solution, because TanStack kind of takes care of that for you. And the idea is you have a query client that wraps your entire application, and then any components or whatever that need to make requests are all dealing with that same query client. And so that query client is caching things. It allows you to basically share them between two components, because when a request is made, that gets stored in the TanStack query cache. And if another component has this exact same query ID, if that request was cached, the data is available instantly. So before a library like this existed, you had to use something like Redux and async actions, and you would then like store it in the Redux store when an async action happens, and then you'd have to implement caching yourself, and then you would use Redux to get that data into other components. But with TanStack, this is all you would need, and now the data associated with that endpoint, as long as it's still valid, can be used via any component just with this code that's using that query. And then TanStack has built-in things for saying like invalidate query. So like a common example would be you have a list of to-dos. So you have a query that gives you that list back from the API. And then you have a mutation that creates a to-do like this. So you can say use mutation. And so this makes like a post request. But typically what you combine this with is an invalidation. So after this succeeds, you then invalidate the list of to-dos in the cache, because now there's a new one, and then the cache will refresh, and then any page that needed that list will have the latest data. So let's see where they do that. There's like an invalidate somewhere. On success, you could call like invalidate. Yeah. Or you can just call the method directly. So on success, you'd say invalidate and then pass in like the to-dos ID, and then everywhere else in your app that was dependent on that list would now get refreshed. So yeah, if you're heavily interfacing with APIs or anything that's like promise-based in your React application, which is, I guess, is typically APIs, TanStack query is definitely the way to go. Beyond that, these days when I'm reaching for a component library, I have mainly settled on Daisy UI, which is built on top of Tailwind. So alone, you can just use Daisy UI with Tailwind, and then you don't need like extra components or anything like that. But you do get these classes like button neutral, button primary, and then you get some nice styles. But there is a Daisy UI React, which is a component library wrapper built on top of Daisy UI, or React Daisy UI is what it's called. And this gives you all the components of Daisy UI, but instead of having class names, you can just directly import a button component. So if you look at their docs, they have, for example, a button. And the way that you bring it in is by importing capital B button from the React Daisy UI, and then you can use these components. So that's the component library I reach for. There are others, but Daisy has been fitting my needs, especially if I'm not doing something that's like highly custom or highly stylized. I can just use their themes or create my own custom theme, and I'm good to go. What else? I don't know. Let me know in the chat. Does anybody have any suggestions for libraries or dev tools that are in every React app that you build? I'd be curious to see. Curious to know. Yeah. Don't use React, says super secret name. But what if you are using React? Yeah, AV Rumi says, I've been using Mantine and ShadCN for UI components. TanStack query does not perform well with Next.js, especially with server components. I have not tried that combination because it seems like with like server components and server actions, you're not really using a secondary library. Everything is just a request, but I don't know. But let's take a look at Mantine, because I looked at ShadCN UI, which is very interesting, but the one thing about it is like you don't actually install anything. So very similar to how there were like Tailwind libraries that came out that they just provide the CSS classes and you're supposed to copy paste them. That's the same thing for ShadCN UI. Like if you want this accordion, they're going to give you all of the code to create that accordion, and then that code lives inside of your code base. They do have a CLI tool, so if you do this, if you do an init first, it sets up all the config and everything, and then when you do add accordion, it's going to create an accordion component in your code base, but it has all the code. It's not importing anything from another library. It's all the code for that specific component. This makes a lot of sense if you are building highly customized and highly branded UIs, right? Because you don't always want to like create a fully accessible button from scratch, but you might want to change the styles to more of an extent than you might be able to change them like in Daisy UI. So that's what ShadCN seems like it's really good at, is you want highly customized UIs to like fit your brand and stuff like that. And I do believe they're using Radix under the hood, because Radix is all about accessibility, right? Or are they? A pre-styled component library. Yeah, so Andrew is saying some components use Radix UI underneath. It's possible that they're pulling in some of the underlying functionality, and then like maybe this is like highly customizable in terms of styles. Fascinating. Cool. And then DK, we were talking about like earlier, I was talking about using TanStack in a client app, and DK is asking, why would you need TanStack for React server components? I'm saying you wouldn't, because all of your data loading would potentially happen in a server component or in a server action. I mean, the main reason you would want something like that is to have a more single page application like experience, right? Like not having a full page reload and being able to update that page itself, not necessarily going to a new page. But yeah. All right, let's see if there are any questions over on Twitch, and we'll jump into those as well. I wonder why mobile needs a different backend. Are they storing some other config in there that they don't need for web? So this is a question that was related to the backend for frontend question that came up earlier. And my guess is they just potentially need data structured in a different way, which is why my instinct would be to just restructure it on the client side, right? The backend stays the same, but then the client will adjust that data. The mobile client will adjust that data as to what they need. I couldn't imagine why any sort of configuration would be different. I think it's really just a matter of needing the data in a different structure based on how the pages are laid out and stuff like that. Okay, Super Secret Name has a question. Is it worth keeping a public API for a service separate from the client, so that if the API goes down from the users, the client is fine, or vice versa? I've seen that everyone says that Next API is better than Express, but I'm not convinced. What are your thoughts? I think it's really cool that when you build APIs inside of Next and you deploy them to Vercel, all of those API functions become serverless functions, like for free. Not for free. I mean, you're paying for the serverless invocations, but it's a whole lot less configuration than if you were to try to do that stuff manually, like with AWS Lambda and like API Gateway. So yeah, the fact that you can have a folder called API with a bunch of handlers in there, and then it just gets deployed in the right way, and you can just easily call them from your Next app, I think that's really cool. And the other aspect of that is getting better like type integration, and also being able to share code because it's in the same code base. You can define your types in that same code base, and you could structure the code in a way where those types are used both in your backend and in your front end code. Whereas if you had a completely separate Express.js app, you'd have to do a lot more to be able to share the types between the two. It's possible. Like you could use something like if you structure your and have an open API definition for your Express app, there are tools that will let you take that definition and turn it into TypeScript types. And then there are also tools that will generate a request client that can be used that integrates those types as well. But yeah, I would probably say the main reason is also like ease of integration, right? You don't have to have a separate backend deployment process. All of your API code can just go in there. It's a single deploy. I think that's the reason that a lot of people choose to build API routes inside of Next is it's also it's very low lift for someone who's new to backend as well. You don't have to know about all the intricacies of like middlewares and everything else. You just define your API function, and then you can call it in your front end, and hey, look, you're a full stack developer now. So that's probably why. I like to build things that are like completely decoupled, but I probably wouldn't use Next.js for that. I would just use like Vite, React, and like React Router. It would be a complete single page application, and then that could talk to an API. Now, you don't get any SSR or server-side rendering with that, but for a lot of applications, you don't need that. It might be an internal app or just something that doesn't need to benefit from being rendered on the server. And that's how I build a lot of things. Yeah. Have I tried the new Vue dev tools? I haven't used the Chrome extension, but you can add it when you're generating a Vue project. You can add it in, and they look cool. There's like a little button you can click, and it like pops up in the UI. I haven't delved into like all the stuff you can do with it though. All right, let's jump back into YouTube questions. Let's see. Will I make a series comparing Svelte with React or Vue? I don't know. I will say that Scott is working on a full tutorial for Svelte 5 when Svelte 5 comes out. So that'll be interesting. Definitely keep an eye on that. I don't know. I think I'm done with the front-end comparison videos for now. Let's see, what else? DK is asking, what's your take on using SST versus a VPS? I've never used it before. So I know SST, I think, is from Dax, and it's how you can deploy Next.js to AWS infrastructure, right? Something like that. Is this the thing I'm thinking of? Yeah, build modern full-stack applications on AWS. So you can deploy Next.js, Svelte, or Astro to AWS in a streamlined manner, because if you were trying to deploy these in a serverless way without this tool, it would be very cumbersome to do. But this basically, you give it your AWS secrets and such, and it's able to provision all the things required to get this stuff deployed. Yeah, so you can have like S3 buckets, etc. So my take is if you're already using AWS infrastructure and you want to have something that's like serverless without a lot of config, it seems great. If you're trying to host a single Next.js app on a single VPS, that's probably fine for like low traffic sites, but the whole reason we deploy to like serverless is being able to handle high traffic, because the serverless framework or whatever else is handling all of that for us. We don't have to worry about spinning up servers or spinning them down. So seems cool. I would use it if I had a reason to. Jethro is asking, how do you structure a Node API? I have some basic templates that might help with that. So if you check out github.com/w3cj/express API starter, I always have a source directory. And then I always have my app separate from the thing that actually starts the app. So if you look at index.js, this just brings in the app and then starts it up. And the reason you want to have those separate is if you're running tests, you want to be able to import the app directly inside of your test instead of starting up the server. So the app itself gets defined here. And then any routes will get just defined in a separate folder. And I also have my middlewares just defined separately. So if you look, I have a middlewares file that has a couple of pretty common ones. I think if I had more custom middleware than this, I would probably create a folder for them and then like have multiple files and then have them imported here. I might even have like a top level use middleware, which in turn loads in all of my middlewares. I realize you can't see this code because the question's in the way. And then from there, all of my routes are in separate files and folders. So if you look in the API folder, I've got my main router here, which then loads in all of the other routers. So the main purpose of this file is to import every router defined in this folder and then map it to a specific URL. So in my basic example here, I have an emojis router that responds with emojis. And then in this file, it gets mounted at /emojis. So when you go to /emojis, it's going to load this router and then load that specific handler and response. Beyond this, so this is like a super basic structure, but your routes might get more complex because you might also have like models or controllers or various other things that are associated with that one specific part of your app. And if that's the case, I would put it in a separate folder. So like I would have a folder called emojis, and then inside of there, I would have a file called middlewares, a file called controller, a file called like data access. And that way it's nice and confined to that one specific folder. I like to have features by folder is the way to describe that. The other way you might see, like in a smaller code base, is you might have a folder for controllers, a folder for schemas, a folder for routers, and then separate them that way. But that gets really hard to manage once each of your individual routes starts to have more and more stuff. So yeah, the feature by folder structure is the way to go. And beyond that, there's a repo called Node.js Best Practices, and they detail a lot of this stuff. Node Best, this is the one. It has 97,000 stars. But they talk about project architecture practices. And so they talk about how to structure things. And this is kind of what I was talking about, where you organize things based on their feature name, not their type name. Like it's not models, schemas, controllers. This is a feature of my app, and then within there you'll have models and schemas and controllers and stuff like that. So yeah, definitely check out this repo because they have a lot more advice beyond just like project structure. They also talk about like error handling and code style. Yeah. And see you later, super secret name. Thank you for hanging out. Cool. All right. Let's grab another question from Twitch. Or not, there's not really any questions, but Frontend Fiend says, I haven't used Nuxt much, but I love the dev tools. Glad the Vue dev tools are looking more like that. Nice. I haven't even seen Nuxt in like over a year, so I should probably try it out and check out the dev tools. Yeah. All right, let's pick another comment or question from YouTube. how can you get the response type from an API using Prisma and Express in a web app if both are in different repositories? The easiest way would be some kind of relative import, right? So typically we would manage, the way you would manage this is with a mono repo, where you could have both of those projects side by side, and then you have a shared project that has like your shared types or shared schemas inside of it, and then that can be imported into those other two projects. But if they are completely separate repositories, there's no easy way to do it. You could potentially add one as a Git dependency of the other. Because if you didn't do that, you could technically, if they live next to each other in a folder, you could have a relative path import, but that might actually break on other people's machines if they don't download both repos and put both of them side by side. So it's tricky. But I think maybe I can find some examples. I'm trying to remember which app I did this for. Yeah, I think it was over on Coding Garden. I was showing how to build like an Express API with TypeScript and then building a React front end for it, and showing how to share the types between those two projects. And I just did it with a relative path import. And it's not ideal because those folders actually do need to live next to each other. So for example, I have my Express API defined here. And let's see what endpoint I have. Yeah, I have a to-dos folder. Here we go. I'm showing you a better description of what I was talking about earlier, like folder structure. Because if you look in here, I have the to-dos folder, and then inside the to-dos folder, I have handlers, models, routes. And if we look at handlers, it has all the endpoints for talking to the database and responding with to-dos. But if we look at the model, this is actually defined with Zod. And I'm going to go ahead and let me move this down a little bit. There. Yeah, so I define my model with Zod, but this type, I want to be able to use this same type on my front end because I'm making a fetch request to this endpoint and then iterating over these to-dos to show them in a list. And it would be really nice if I could actually use this type in my client-side code. And so the way I did it in this example is a relative import. So these two projects live side by side, but if we look inside of here and we look potentially at my API, I put them in a common place to make the code easier to manage. So I created a types file, but if we look in that types file is actually importing them relatively from the folder above it, right? And that's one way to do it. Now, this is not ideal if you have a setup where those two projects aren't going to be side by side, right? Because if these were living in two completely separate repositories and someone cloned down this client, it would just fail to build because this file wouldn't be accessible. They would have to explicitly put that other folder right beside it. But you could put them into a shared repo. You can convert to a mono repo. That might be one way to do it. Ultimately, the worst case is you just have the types exist in both places. So you could generate the types using Prisma and then just copy paste those into your other project. But then at some point they're going to get out of sync. You could also use an extension that is paste JSON as types. So make a request to that specific endpoint and then get back the response, convert it into a type, and then just paste that type into the code base that needs it. But the main issue with both those scenarios is if the API ever changes, now your types are out of sync. So the best way is to have a mono repo and a shared library. Second best, put those two folders side by side. Worst case, just duplicate the types in both of the projects. But yeah, thank you for your question. Cool. Let's find another one. I have to do a thing on Twitch chat. Give me a second. No mods? I'm the mod. All right, let's see what else YouTube has to say. Rawl asks, why is there so much of a move towards SSR over SPA nowadays? Isn't the SPA pattern still relevant in a lot of use cases? Yes, and don't let anyone tell you that it's not. SSR makes sense if you have content that needs to be search indexed, and when web search engines are crawling the web, if they come across your site and it's server-side rendered, it's going to load faster for the crawler, and it's going to have all of the content for that specific crawler. So that's one reason to have SSR. And then, I mean, you could also make the case that like the initial page load for SSR a lot of times is faster because there's not multiple requests that need to happen. Because with a single page application, typically the page loads, then like fetch kicks in to request some data, and that requires another request, and then the page updates. But I would argue that like over time, as the user uses your application, it kind of like levels out, because typically with a single page application, you can deliver all of the JavaScript and basically the entire client site that the user needs on the initial load, so that you pay that price once. And then after that, the only price you're paying is a request to an API. And there's nuance to that too, because you don't have to load the entire application. You could also have lazy loading of pages and components, where the main shell of the website loads on initial page load, but then if a user goes to a specific page, that downloads the JavaScript for that page dynamically. But that also gets cached, so the next time they come to that page, that's already cached, and literally all they have to do is like make an API request. I don't know. I like single page applications a lot, and I think you see a lot of them on in internal applications, right? So people that are building things in enterprise, like internal dashboards, internal tools, where there's really no reason to have server-side rendering because it's only being accessed by the people that actually work at that company and have access within that company. So yeah, spas still have their place. And when I worked at a consultancy, we would typically have a strategy where if the client needed some sort of like landing page or marketing website, we would build that with WordPress, but then the actual application would be at a subdomain like app.yourcompanyname.com. And that was a single page application that like talked to an API. Because a lot of times we had clients that would not only have a web app, they would also have a native app. So like a native iOS app and a native Android app. We weren't really using native script for anything at the consultancy I worked at. And when you're dealing with native iOS or Android, they typically are talking to some kind of API. So it made sense for our architecture to have an API that could be shared by the mobile app and also the web app. I don't know. I guess the other aspect of this is to why there's such a move. I would say there's a move. I would say the conversation has moved, and especially if you're on Twitter a lot, because on Twitter we hear a lot from Vercel and React and Next.js, and their business is in server-side rendering. So it would make sense that you would hear a lot of it. But I'm not convinced that everything should be converted to it. And you could even get into the idea of building things with like HTMX and some other backend that does the rendering itself, because then you have less client-side JavaScript. But again, that architecture kind of only works to serve a single type of client, an HTMX client. If you have any other type of client, like a desktop app or a mobile app, you're going to need some kind of API or separate endpoint that serves those specific clients, which is why almost all the time I keep falling back to the idea of, well, yeah, it just makes sense to have a generalized API here, and then any of my clients can talk to it. So I don't know. I wouldn't even say, yeah, well, actually, I guess technically, like with Next.js and SSR, they're not really monoliths. Like it's a monolithic code base, but technically gets deployed in a distributed serverless way. I don't know. I don't think Scott is here right now, but he's the one working on the Svelte tutorial series, and I believe it's learning Svelte from the ground up by building things, and specifically Svelte 5. That's what his tutorial is going to be. Winter QQ1 asks, what do I need to start applying for dev jobs? You need probably some personal projects. You probably need a personal website. You need a resume. You need to be able to have the skills to do the things that are asked of you in interviews, which varies depending on the type of jobs that you're applying for. But a lot of times companies require that you might need to do like leak code or whiteboarding. And so if that's the case, you should know how to do those things as well. I'm going to see if anybody had any comments about the other stuff that I was talking about. Yeah. What am I using for my beard? Nothing. Nothing. Thank you for your question, though, Mom. A comb? A comb? And then on the point of like SSR and stuff like that, Mr. Rappic is saying, I love to use tRPC, but it keeps my types on sync. And it keeps my types on sync. The projects are not so huge, so it's worth it. Yeah, and I think especially if you already have some sort of like mono repo setup, using something like tRPC is huge. Like you don't necessarily have to define like a Express API or something like that. You could use tRPC. I think the main issue comes again is if you have clients that are like Android or iOS, I don't know if they actually have like a tRPC client. You would end up just like using the REST API itself. So that's when it becomes a little bit trickier. And when using something like Open API with like a client code gen maybe will work better because they have code generators for like native iOS and native Android. But if you have full stack JavaScript, tRPC makes a lot of sense. Ahmed says, we have all these full stack frameworks. Do you think it's a good idea to bring server issues to front end developers to debug and solve? I always find it really painful to use the debugger. I mean, I think every programmer could benefit from learning how to debug better, but that is one of the downsides of moving to more full stack is you have people that potentially aren't ready for it, or maybe don't have the debugging skills or the backend skills to figure out the issues when they happen. They're just kind of given Next.js. And I think this is happening with a lot of programmers as they were used to just writing like client-side React, but now all of a sudden their company's using Next.js, and now all of a sudden the API endpoints are in the exact same code base, and so they're maybe asked to implement those features as well. I don't think it's anything you can't learn, but yeah, I think getting used to using like interactive debugging as well is also an acquired skill. Yeah. And so on the idea of SSR, so Infitates is saying, I think the move is also because you can SSR and client-side fetching in the same app, so that gives flexibility. Yeah, so that gets into basically like hybrid rendering. So like with a Next.js application, it is possible that the initial page load is server-side rendered, and then from there it kicks in and behaves as a single page application. But then the story gets a little murky or tricky when you start talking about React server components, unless you're using something like server actions. But there's advice that server actions should only be used for mutations, not for fetching data. And I guess technically, if you navigate to a separate page inside of a React server component Next.js application, once the page is loaded, if you're navigating, that still technically just happens on the client. But the server components themselves are typically entire pages. So if you're navigating, I don't, it's hard to describe. The architecture gets really tricky with server components. But yes, you're right. You do get like hybrid rendering technically, but it gets a little bit trickier once you're dealing with React server components. You potentially might combine that with API requests, but yeah. Yeah. How are you unit testing ES modules? I'm currently using Jest, and it's a bit of a nightmare as you need to compile ESM modules to CJS before starting the tests. If Vitest has an answer, is the migration worth it? I don't know if they have an answer exactly, but I have used I think it's like the Vitest TypeScript runner or something like that, or just like supports TypeScript. Let me see in this React TS starter. I believe I'm using Vitest in this. So this is using Vitest, and then I think it just works. Like my setup files are just in TypeScript. Yeah, like setup test is just a TS file, and then Vitest is able to pick that up. So literally just run Vitest, and it transpiles on the fly. And so that's specifically with TypeScript. I imagine it'd be able to do the same thing if you were just in module mode. I can't confirm it though. I mean, I guess we could try. Should we do that? Should we set up a quick repo and like try to unit test some ES modules with Vite? But I guess clarify, Dale. Does that mean you're not using TypeScript? You're just using ESM? I would be curious to know. But who wants to see that? Just say yes in chat if you want to see me set up a repo and try to test it with Vitest. ESM with Vitest. Oh yeah, and Paolo is saying it is worth it to switch, so apparently that's the case. Dan says, this whole stream setup is awesome. What advice would you give to someone trying to grow with technical content creation? Just keep at it. Just keep going. I mean, I've been doing this for a very long time. And so I think that's how I got somewhat decent at it, is just the amount of reps. Like if you look at my Coding Garden channel, I have like over 500 live streams that I've done. I guess technically it won't list all the live streams because some of the, eventually I started only streaming on Twitch. Yeah, my advice is just do it and do it a lot and you'll get better at it. And you'll also form your own opinions and find new tools. And because my whole stream setup right now has like evolved over time. Like I'm actually using a legit mirrorless camera. I used to use like a USB camera that worked well enough. And I'm just using the Shure MV7, which is a USB thing. Seems to work for what I need. And then I've used OBS so much that I've gotten really accustomed to like overlays. Like the way that you're seeing the chat message pop up is a Chrome extension that provides a browser overlay source, and then I have that running inside of OBS. And then beyond that, just today, I set up these borders and like the animated background animation. But this is actually like a looping video file. So if I disable the chroma key, this is actually what's happening. This is a video that's looping. And if you look at the background, it's like animated. It's like the syntax logo is zooming in and out and the background is zooming in and out. But then I just chroma key those sections out and then load my video into them. There's other ways to do it. There are plugins for OBS that will actually like allow you to add borders and stuff. But I don't know. My advice, just do it. Lots of practice. Yeah, you'll get there. And also focus on community. For me, Coding Garden had a big focus on community in terms of just like being nice to people, answering their questions, kind of being on a regular basis too. So people knew when I would be live and would be able to tune in and knew that they would see the same faces in the chat and stuff like that. So yeah. Cool. Let's get a question from Twitch chat. At least they were playing. Yeah, someone was advertising like their stream service. I don't know. What's up, Ed? Welcome in. Have you found any barriers to developing C# on a Mac? No. As long as you're using the latest .NET platform, it is fully cross-platform. If you come across a .NET framework or one other thing, those don't work on Mac. And if you might find some libraries that only support those, but as long as you're using libraries that support the .NET platform, you should be fine. This was probably like 4 or 5 years ago at this point, but let's call it 4 years ago. Let's call it 3.5 years ago. I was doing some C# work working at the consultancy that I was working at. And it was actually insane that I was able to not only write the code on my MacBook, but I had Microsoft SQL Server running in a virtual machine all on my Mac. So my Mac was like a full-fledged Microsoft development machine, which years ago you probably would have never thought something like that would happen. But yeah, I haven't run into any issues. Okay, Andrew has a question who says, I'm working on a dashboard of live camera feeds and camera sensor data. Each camera has its own WebSocket connection. What do you think would be the best way to manage all the active WebSocket connections in a React app along with all the state? I need to get some of the data in multiple components. Zustand is probably your best way to go. Zustand. Zustand? But basically, you can create a store, create this in some other file, and then use that store in any of your components. And this store could potentially have a list of like stream URLs. You could have a method for adding a stream URL or removing one. And then your components can say use store. They could get access to that list and ask for like a specific URL, like a specific stream from the state. Is probably by far the easiest way to do it. You could use the context API, but if that data is changing frequently, you might run into some performance issues. So I would say go with Zustand. Yeah. Best way to manage all the active WebSocket connections. Yeah, so you might do that. Now, maybe you didn't see this, Andrew, but I released a video recently on syntax where I show how I built a stock dashboard in both Vue and React. And it is this video here. And so this connects to the Yahoo Finance stock API, and you can add multiple stock symbols and it gives you a little dashboard, but all of this is managed via a single WebSocket connection. And then all of my components are talking to that library to say, subscribe to this specific stock symbol, but then the underlying library just handles all of that with a single connection. So that might be the way to go too, is you basically create a library outside of React and then interface with that library inside of Zustand. Probably the best way to go. If you look at the repo for this, you can see how I did it. Where if you look in the React example, source, and then pages, and then stocks, there is this Yahoo Finance file module. And ultimately, this module exposes a few functions. It exposes initialize the WebSocket connection, close the WebSocket connection, subscribe to a specific stock symbol, unsubscribe to a specific stock symbol. So all of the hard work of sending WebSocket messages and validating them and receiving them and everything else, all of that is handled in these functions here. But my React code only ever calls these methods. It doesn't have to do any of the specific work. So if you look in the main page, the page itself initializes the socket connection. And then the underlying components like this can subscribe to a specific one. But because they're using that module, it is handling the WebSocket messages and WebSocket connection under the hood. So that's probably how I'd go about it. Use something like Zustand and then potentially abstract out all of the complex logic and then just call methods from your React apps, React components instead of doing it in there directly. Yeah. And thank you for the follow, Laser. Appreciate you. All right, what else do we got? Pranjal asks, if you had to learn app dev and React Native in 2024, how would you go about it? Go to the docs first, anyways. But the answer here is probably Expo. Let's just see if we search React Native, what do we find? Okay, we have reactnative.dev. I think it was announced at ReactConf that they officially, you should be using Expo along with React Native. Yeah, start a React Native project with Expo. But if you're asking from complete beginner, like someone who knows nothing about programming, you do not jump immediately into React. You should learn the core ideas behind HTML, CSS, and JavaScript before diving in. And then I would learn React outside of React Native, so you just understand how like the render cycle and how components work in React, and then potentially jump into React Native. That would be my path. And use Expo to do it, because they have like a CLI tool and everything else. I realize that's not a super detailed answer, but if you have more clarifications, feel free to ask. Dale says, I'm using TypeScript too. My Jest config is using TS Jest under the hood to transpile. I think Jest just becomes sticky when working with ESM or JS files from node modules. I see. Okay. I think you probably, here's the thing. I have personally done it in a not so complex app, but I have converted from Jest to Vite And a lot of times, all you have to do is replace the import or potentially modify your setup test file, and it just works. So maybe you try it in isolation. So like just create a branch, npm install Vitest, and see how many errors you run into just by swapping out Vitest for Jest or for TS Jest. Because in a lot of cases, it kind of is like a drop-in replacement. I need to share my OBS config. I've never really shared it before. It's just a bunch of, I guess, if I show this on screen, am I going to reveal anything? I guess I won't. So I have my starting soon scene. And it's just a scene that has like an animated logo thingy. And then I've got this scene, and then this scene. It's actually not that complex. I have all of my cameras and microphones, everything set up in here. One thing I do have is the move plugin. So this is a plugin that gives you the move transition. So you'll see when I go from this scene to this scene, the camera kind of widens out and expands out. And that's because of that move transition. And then the other thing is, if you're watching on Twitch, you should have access to subtitles, and that's because I'm using this plugin, which adds closed captions. And so that sends the closed captions along with the stream, so that way you can look at them directly on Twitch. But yeah. Cool. Yeah, you're welcome, Dan. Just keep at it. Keep at it. Keep doing it. Paolo says, I've had a question before if you need some more questions. We'll see. Let's see what else we got. And how long have I been live? Now we've probably got another 30 or so minutes of stream left. What's my thought on getting an iPad? iPads are cool. I have my wife's old one. I don't use it that much, but it is cool when I need it because I have the Apple Pencil and whatever the main drawing app that people use is. And I've used that in a couple of the videos on the Syntax channel. So if you have a use for it, like if you need a tablet, an iPad is probably, you can't go wrong. Cool. So Daisy has a question. What have been the most handy SQL functions to make data reports and comparisons easier? And are there any particular sites or tools you would recommend to help someone get better with T-SQL? I don't think I have any advice for this. Most of the apps that I've built, the queries are custom to every endpoint that I'm creating. And I haven't really worked very much with like report creation. I've done things that create reports, but it's really just all based on the same data that's being used inside the app I'm using, or the app I'm building, with maybe a few transformations or summaries or whatever else. I don't have a good answer. If anybody in the chat does, feel free to share them. Yeah. And Joaquim says, I just want to say your vids really helped me level up my self-hosting. I'm glad to hear it, Joaquim. Cool. But yeah, Paolo, if you're still out there and you've got any questions, feel free. And Kirill has a question. What are your thoughts on Rails and Hotwire resurgence? Obviously, all enterprise VC-backed startups will go the TypeScript and JavaScript route, but it seems like if you want to just build solo projects, is that the way? I have not looked into it. Is Hotwire the thing where it's like React over the web? What? I don't even know. I don't even know what Hotwire is. HTML over the wire. It's an alternative approach to building modern web apps without using much JavaScript by sending HTML instead of JSON over the wire. This is like HTMX, right? Hot Rails. Learn how to create modern single-page reactive web applications with Ruby on Rails without any custom JavaScript code. Fascinating. I don't know much about it. I'd have to do more research. So my thoughts on its resurgence is I didn't know that it was resurging. um, I think probably the reason startups would pick something like React or Next is just because of its prevalence and the amount of people that know it. Like Ruby on Rails used to be the default for a lot of startups, like 7-8 years ago. Which is why now you actually see job postings for Ruby on Rails jobs, and it's hard. Like Rails developers are harder to come by. But the reason you see those posts is because these startups use this tech to build their app, build their company, back when they started that many years ago. But it was never not bad. Like Ruby on Rails is like super all inclusive. Like you can literally have an entire CRUD app with a UI and a backend in a single line of generation code, which is amazing. And there's not much like it in the JavaScript world. There are some things that try to be, like there's the Sales.js, which tries to be kind of like the Ruby on Rails of the Node.js world. There's also Adonis.js, which is probably closer to like Laravel, but still tries to be like all inclusive. So yeah, that's my answer, is that I don't know. Let's see. Yeah, so Paolo has a question about async local storage. Let's see. From your knowledge, is async local storage generally available in all runtimes? Do you have some resource like can I use for runtimes where I can check if it's available? Let's see. What is async local storage? Is it in? It's in Node.js. Maybe there's like a polyfill. Yeah, because this is a Node.js API. I see, but you're saying runtimes. So like if you're running inside of Bun or Dino, do they have async local storage? I have no idea. I've never actually used this. I'd be curious if there's some kind of like generalized polyfill that could be used like in Bun or Dino or something like that. Yeah, so they do have the no, so you could because Dino now has like node compatibility layer, you technically can bring it in from node async hooks. Fascinating. What about Bun? The issue got closed. Does that mean it's there? Oh yeah, it got merged in last year. So you can technically use it inside of Bun too. Personally, I don't know where you would look for this. Like I don't think, is there a can I use for backend runtimes? I know there's like the Kangax compatibility table. But that's just for like ECMAScript. And I guess technically async local storage isn't ECMAScript, is it? Yeah, this is the ES6 compatibility table. This is the one that I always used to go to because it has like engines and browsers and everything. But yeah, I'll look at the latest chat. Yeah, Paolo says it's a server API for the moment. They plan to add something similar in the browser, but I'm more interested on the runtimes. Cloudflare workers should also support it, but I can't really find any utility that shows everyone. I see what you're saying. Yeah, so basically we're looking for something like this, but for Node.js, but for JavaScript runtimes. Because this shows ECMAScript features. Let's see if it's even listed under async local. Let's see if this, can I search their site? I don't know. If this doesn't exist, you should create it because that would be great. JS runtimes, compatibility, supported. Table? Yeah, I don't know of anything. Aside from going to each of those respective runtimes and seeing do they support that specific thing. So yeah, I don't have a good answer for you. All right, but we do have a question from over on Twitch from Laser, who says, I'm a junior developer in Ruby on Rails in web. I find it difficult to combine React for the front end and Rails for the back end to stay competitive in the job market. Do I need to stop using Rails? Thanks for your constructive advice. Another question, if possible, why do most devs hate Ruby on Rails and why? I don't know if this question had already come in after someone had talked about Ruby on Rails and like Hotwire. Okay, but yeah, the first question, to stay competitive in the market, do I need to stop using Rails? It depends. Yeah, I guess it depends on where you live. You should, I'm guessing this question is coming from the fact that maybe you've looked at job postings in your area and you're not seeing as many for Ruby on Rails as you are for React. In my experience, the postings that are for Ruby on Rails typically are asking for like senior level developers because typically they have like an older code base and they're trying to get someone more experienced in. So yeah, it's going to vary widely depending on the job market and like where you live. But I don't think you need to stop using it. I think the other one of the things about Ruby on Rails is it hides the complexity of a lot of the things that are involved with like building backends and building APIs, which makes it harder if you haven't done the work to try and understand the underlying principles. Because the thing is, if you want to combine something like with Ruby on Rails with React, you could just treat Ruby on Rails as a backend API. And it's probably possible if we look at Ruby on Rails JSON API. Basically, we want to build our backend with Ruby. Yeah, using Rails for API-only applications. So basically, we would use Rails to implement our backend. It would talk to our database. It would implement some kind of JSON API that exposes endpoints for getting data from that database and putting data back into that database. But that's all it would do. And then you could build a completely separate React app that just calls that API. And then earlier, I talked about this thing called TanStack query. And so this is a library you can bring into React that makes it a lot easier to integrate with REST APIs or JSON APIs inside of your client-side React apps. So that's one approach I would take, because beyond that thing, I don't know if they have any solutions for this, but it gets much trickier if you want to have like a server-rendered Rails app where then a React app kicks in once the page has loaded. That seems like a lot trickier to do. I don't know if they have any sort of templates for that or examples of people doing that out there in the world. But in my mind, the easiest way to do it is just use Rails for your API and then just have a completely Vite-powered React app that talks to that API. That would be my advice. And then from there, also, you could potentially, once you learn how to build APIs with Rails, you'll be learning more of like the underlying principles of like requests and responses and HTTP headers and stuff like that. And then all of that knowledge is useful if you want to build a backend API with something like Express.js or Fastify or Hono or something like that, or Hono, because they basically allow us to define APIs, but using JavaScript or TypeScript. And but they still respond in the same way. They still respond with JSON. And technically, you could build as long as you created the exact same backend endpoints, if you re-implemented it with like Express or Fastify or something like that, your React app wouldn't care. As long as that other backend has the same endpoints and is responding in the same way, your React app would still continue to work. And that's just because of the nature of the architecture. Like the React app in this case would be dependent on the JSON API. It wouldn't be dependent on what that JSON API was built with. Yeah, okay. And then the last question, why do most devs hate Ruby on Rails? Oh, so why most devs hate Ruby on Rails and why? People hate what they don't understand. And also, people hate when things seem like magic or when things have opinions or conventions that they're not familiar with. And that's typically the case with Ruby on Rails, because Ruby on Rails is heavily opinionated in that every Ruby on Rails app looks exactly the same. Let's see if we can look at a folder structure of Ruby on Rails. Like, they always put the same things in the same places. Like, you have your app folder, and that's always going to have that same stuff, and you have your controllers folder and your helpers folder. And so, like, these are the opinions that they've enforced on you, that if you put your code in this way, the app will work. But one of the benefits of that is, as long as you follow those opinions and conventions, then it's easier to build things sometimes. So, like, earlier I talked about, you could generate a full CRUD application with Ruby on Rails with a single command line, and it generates your front end, it generates your back end routes, like everything. And that's because Ruby on Rails, the underlying runtime and framework, knows that if all these specific files exist in these specific places and they have the right codes in them, then it's just going to work. There's a lot less glue code that you need to write because there's a lot of magic behind the scenes. And so for some people, that's great. For other people, they maybe don't want to take the time to understand and learn when and why Ruby on Rails is doing things the way it's doing them. And so for them, it's always an uphill battle of like, well, I want to do this and I'm used to doing it this way, but now I have to figure out how to do it the Rails way. So that's probably the most likely reason. Yeah. Thank you for your question, Laser. Let's get back to the YouTube chat. Cephadine is asking the question. What are your thoughts about tRPC, and is it useful in a SvelteKit app since it's type safe-ish? We talked about tRPC earlier. I really like tRPC if you need some kind of API, because then it's really easy to get full stack type safety. But inside of a SvelteKit app, there's potentially less and less reasons to use it, because SvelteKit does have like full stack types. Like, it's possible to define your action, your loader, I guess it's called, or server action. I forget the names that SvelteKit uses, but it's possible to define them, and then the types flow through, so your client-side code gets instant access to those types. I guess the main issue comes in once the page has loaded and you need to load new data. You potentially have to use something like fetch, which may not be typed. But let's look at data loading inside of SvelteKit. SvelteKit mentioned. Yeah, what's up, pal? So the idea here is like, this is the, let's get the server data. Yeah, page data. So let's say you needed some data on your front end. You could have page.server. It talks to your database. It returns that data. Now, inside of the actual component, you get access to a data property that will have post on it, and it will be of the right type. It'll be the type of this return thing. And so that's the first reason to not reach for something like tRPC, is this already gives you types in that direction, and that when you're implementing the code on the page itself, this data property here is fully typed. Actually, we should switch to TypeScript here. But yeah, the data property is fully typed, and then you can access data.post, and all of the types flow through. So that's great. But the issue comes in, well, let's say the page is already loaded and you don't want to navigate to another page, but you want to make a request for data and also have that be fully typed. That's when things get a little bit trickier. As far as I know, maybe you can help me out, Pablo. Has Svelte implemented anything to give you like type safety with fetch? Yeah, because like right here, not yet. So yeah, Pablo is saying they have not implemented anything yet. But this is the main issue that I'm talking about, is like with SvelteKit, technically you could create like an API folder and then define handlers inside of there that only return JSON data. But if you write this code in your client component, let's see if we can see one with the client. They're not even doing the fetch in the client component. But if you wrote this fetch code in a client component, now item is of the any type. you would have to manually go and say res.json as the specific type that you expect back from that API endpoint. And that's this is the one part where you don't get full stack type safety like you would with tRPC. And so this might be a reason to bring in something like tRPC, is that instead of using fetch directly, you set up tRPC for all of your API endpoints, and now you get like a fully typed endpoint here using the tRPC client. So that would be one reason to bring it in. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, Pablo has a good question. Then at that point, can you get that data within the load function and invalidate the load with a form submission? Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, this is not something I have tried, but basically what Pablo, the real name is Pablo, what they're mentioning is instead of using fetch requests, you set it up in your page or layout data, and then when you need new data, you call invalidate, which causes it to rerun. I have never used it like that or done it like that, but that seems like a viable option. Yeah. Yeah, and Scott is saying, personally, I use load 100% of the time instead of bringing in a third-party system like tRPC. And so basically what both Pablo and Scott are saying is all of your data loading code should happen in that page.server.ts. Do all your data loading code here, and then it's always going to be fully typed. And then I'm not familiar with like invalidating. Let's see. Yeah, so instead of using a fetch, you could have a form that invalidates the path that you're on, and then the data would dynamically reload. I don't think it would cause a full page refresh because Svelte is smart enough to just make it a XML HTTP request or whatever else. Yeah. So you can invalidate specific load functions with invalidate and then pass it in. Cool. So that might be the way to go too. Yeah. So I think, so both Scott and Pablo are Svelte ambassadors and they are saying you probably don't need something like tRPC. Yeah. And Joaquim is mentioning, I live in Denmark and everyone uses Ruby on Rails over there. Yeah. So this goes to the question we were talking about earlier, where they asked about Ruby on Rails, and it's going to vary by market and vary by country and everything else as well. That's absolutely true. And Piano is asking, can't Zod help with this? Potentially, but not in a mostly streamlined way. You still would have to import the type in both places, which is not the same thing as like the types flowing through. So, for example, in this case, posts is a type that has two properties, title and content. Inside my component here, data.post has that type. I didn't have to specifically put that type on it. That type flows through because I'm using the page data type here. With a fetch request, it just has the any type. If you're using something like Zod, you could potentially import that type schema or the specific type of that thing, and then use like an assertion and say as that type. But it's more cumbersome because everywhere you make a fetch request, you'd have to do this. And so the types aren't flow, and you could lie. The code could lie because it's possible that this API endpoint doesn't return that type exactly, but then you're using a type assertion to say that it does. I will say, if you check out Nuxt, which is Vue, it has nothing to do with Svelte, but they've figured this out, which was one of the really, really cool things about it, is you can define API functions. Let's see. Do I want examples? I think I want the guide, the directory structure, server. Yeah. But in this case, you can have API functions that just return data. And then inside your component, they have this custom hook called useFetch. But somehow they figured this out. They're able to do it. They give you type completion for all of the possible API endpoints here. And so every endpoint you've defined is the path to it is strongly typed. And then the data that you get back is also strongly typed. Basically, SvelteKit needs to do this. It would be really great if SvelteKit was able to do this. Because the other aspect of this is when this is running inside of server-side rendered code, instead of making an external API request, the code is smart enough to actually just go invoke this function directly because it's running in the same context. But then after the page loads, if it's behaving as a single page application, it actually makes a fetch request to this endpoint. So I don't know. Nuxt has figured this out. I feel like the other frameworks should figure this out too. Yeah. Raul says, I know this question won't reach CJ in time, but can someone please explain like I'm 5 type safety and why it is so important? It's important because it helps us write better code with less code, basically. It gives us, as long as our types are written in the right way, and written in the right way, it gives us some assurances, right? So, and let's take, for example, this page load here, right? So let's say this is actually running on the server, and when the page loads, it gets access to this data from the server. If this were just plain old JavaScript, you could write whatever code you want. You could write data.banana, and you're not going to run into an error there until that code goes to execute. But by having the type safety to say that, well, if I type data.banana right here, I'm going to get a TypeScript compiler error that says, hey, this type only has the properties title and content. There is no banana. So it basically just, it ensures that the code that we write is doing the things we say it is doing. And so that's why we prefer it. And that's also why I like types to flow through and full stack type safety, because if you imagine a scenario where you have a completely separate API backend and a completely separate like React client, one of the ways that we get type safety there is by actually just defining the API types in our React app. But the issue there is if the API that we're talking to ever changes its responses, now the types that we've written inside of our React app are lying to us, because at the end of the day, it's kind of it's still just a linter, but those types would say, hey, that API is going to respond in this way, but the API might respond in some other way. But with full stack type safety, all of those types flow through so that whatever types are defined in your backend code are the same types you're using in your frontend code, which means there are some assurances there as to what data is available versus like what you get access to. That's the main reason. Hopefully that was enough to explain it like you're 5. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, and if you're using forms, you don't need invalidate. Every form submission will invalidate. Fascinating. Yeah, using forms is like a whole different thing. Like, I mean, if you were in heavy like client-side development for a long time, everything was just handled by JavaScript. But now with like Next.js and SvelteKit, there's definitely more of a push to use forms to do things. Yeah. There's already a PR for this, but given the current focus on Svelte 5, it's kind of still icy. So Svelte wants to add good types for API functions. But yeah. Yeah. Cool, Ralph. Glad to hear it. All right. I'm just going to double check that no other questions came in on like Discord or Twitter, and then we might get out of here. Let's see. Cool. I don't see any, but if you have any lingering questions, feel free to ask them. I'll do my best to answer them. And Arctic Monkey says, Joaquim says, don't know if you missed my question about Kafka. I did. Let's see if I can find it. Let's see. I'll be honest, I don't know much about Kafka. So, but yeah, earlier NEL asked, do you have experience with React Query? Yeah, I've used TanStack Query in a couple of apps. Here we go. Do I have any resources or recommendations to dive deeper in maintaining Kafka in a production environment? Would this be something you would consider to create a video for? I don't have any experience with Kafka. I have done some basic research into like what it is. Apache Kafka, right? And I know it is an open source distributed event streaming platform. So I know it's used to allow like services to communicate with each other. It can have like a message queue and like an event bus at scale, essentially. When I was building an app, I ended up using Redis for this because they have a message queuing system. I think Apache Kafka can potentially do other things too. But yeah, I don't have any resources because I barely know anything about it. And if I made a video, it would probably just be an introductory video. Like, what is it? Not necessarily like how to actually run it in production. Yeah. Yeah, okay, so Arctic Monkey is asking, talking about forms, I'm not satisfied using React Hook form. Has anyone used TanStack form? I haven't. I have like React Hook form is probably the library I've used most in the React world. It's like the constant. I used Formic a long time ago too, but I have not looked at TanStack form. Let's take a look. All right. We have a field info component. We have validators. And then a render. This looks a lot like Formic. What about, do they have integrations with like Zod? Like if you pass a Zod validator? It honestly looks a lot more manual than React Hook form because you are having to pass in like value and on blur and stuff. Whereas like React Hook form comes with a register function that hooks all of that up for you. So if we look at an example here with a schema, so you have your form schema, you specify the resolver here. I guess they have it for Zod too. This is using yep. And then they have this register function. I mean, you're still technically spreading it, so it's like adding all of those props onto it, but it adds all the right props. I guess it gets trickier whenever you're trying to wrap another component library. Because if you're doing that, then you have to do integrating with UI libraries. Then you specifically have to bring in the controller component, and then it gets trickier because you're wrapping it in a controller component and then doing the other stuff. But yeah. I don't know. From the examples I've seen, I probably would still choose React Hook form. Maybe I don't know the major benefits of using it. I guess it makes sense if you're like loading initial form data, because then you can integrate with TanStack query. But yeah, I don't know. My advice is keep using React Hook form because I haven't really found anything better than it. Joaquim says, fair enough, thank you so much. I'm using it in production, but whenever I see someone talking about it, I always learn something new. I see. Superforms. I have not heard of Superforms. Let's check it out. Oh, for SvelteKit. I see. I have used Superforms. Pretty sure. But for SvelteKit, not for React. In the listed app that I was working on over on Coding Garden, we used Superform. I did it without it first, and then someone mentioned, hey, you should use this library. The amount of configs in this project is ridiculous, but I think we used Superforms. It's cool. It basically integrates like a Zod validator with like form submission. It's cool. And then conform is also nice if you don't like React hook form. Let's see. React conform. Type safe form validation library. Okay, define your schema. They're doing server actions. Wow. And we have our use form hook. Pass in the name. Pass in the display the errors. I guess this is cool because these are basically like not controlled components, right? Like with controlled components, you're setting the value and you have an on change listener, but I'm guessing the form submission here actually reads in the form data. Yeah, so parse with Zod comes from conform, and it's able to easily take your form data and turn it to an object and parse it with Zod, the Zod schema validator. So that's pretty cool. This is probably the majority of the work that this that this library is doing, is like handling that form data and making sure it's like pulling all the values from the fields and everything. Honestly, this library makes a lot of sense if you're using React server components on the surface, anyways. Because React hook form, you basically have to it's a client component. I guess technically this is a client component too, because it's using the use form hook. Cool. But what I do like is, I guess if you're using, I forget what it's called. I think it literally is a form action. Like you can label this form as an action, and then if JavaScript isn't enabled, it would still call this handler. But this library actually gives you that parsing that form data into this schema. I don't know. It seems cool. I like it. I'll probably have to check it out. Thank you for suggesting that, binary guy. And Arctic Monkey says, I also used Formic in the past, and React hook form is a good improvement. But still, it's hard to debug why the validation is failing, and sometimes the errors object is empty, but isValid is still false. Oh. I haven't really run into that, but ultimately, you could just do some console logging in a use effect. Because, yeah, you could just have a use effect that's dependent on errors and is error. And I think there's also a way to tap into the actual error that gets thrown by your validator. I don't know. Seems weird. Yeah. Francois says, regarding episode 799, are there plans to animate a CSS flex gap when an element is inserted? I can animate the element width on insert, but the gap still jumps when the element becomes displayed. Oh. I have no idea, but I will point everyone to episode 799. Because they talked about new browser APIs, and specifically, are you talking about the animating width? Is that the one? I know that Wes made a quick video about this recently, in terms of being able to animate size or animate width. No, size, animating size, because you can go from size 0 to auto, and then you're able to animate now. But yeah, I have no idea about animating gap. I don't know if that's in the plans or anything like that. Yeah. Yeah, Scott says, I almost never bring in a form library for Svelte, but always do for React. Yeah, it seems like with Svelte, pretty much all you need is a schema validator, and you're kind of good to go. But that Superforms library does a lot of the boilerplate of like converting your form data into an object and stuff like that. But yeah, I would agree with that. Binary Guy says, got introduced to conform from the remix side of things, and I've been using it for some stuff. Still prefer React hook form. Yeah. And Cephadine is saying, I find the duo of superform and supervalidate very useful. Yeah. George says, I skipped your library question. Let me find it. Sorry if I did. Maybe, let's see. feel like that was one of the first questions we answered, right? Oh, you're right. Let's talk about this. So George is asking, what's the best way and good practices to create a JavaScript library or a React library? There are templates and boilerplates that will help you out, because some of the things you want to think about when you're writing a library is you probably want to write your code with TypeScript. Whenever you distribute your library to something like npm, you want to make sure that it's available as like ES modules, or it could be or as like in a common JS format. You want to make sure that when you publish it, it can be imported into a project regardless of what the module type is or how you wrote it. So you need some kind of build process for that. And then the other thing to think about is you want a somewhat streamlined way of releasing new versions of your project. Now, what can I recommend for this? I mean, first of all, like Vite. I think Vite has a. Do they have a scaffold for just a library? I thought they did. Yeah, Vite library mode. Yeah, so this allows you to develop a browser-oriented library. So basically, like, and you're not building a full-on app. You're basically building, like a module that could be imported into various libraries, or you might be building a component library. So they have that. I will say, right now, my mind actually goes to using something like Nx, because they have scaffolds that will generate a lot of that stuff for you. So if you look, see if we can look at look at the plugins. They have a plugin for like Vue and React and everything else, but I believe each of these plugins can be customized. So when you generate a project with it, you can say this is a library, and then it will specifically set it up so that you're not creating an actual React app, you're creating like a component library. Let's see. Yeah, you can add the plugin. And then trying to remember. I feel like they're specifically I think they specifically have a Node library plugin that I've used. Yeah, so Node. And then this lets you create like a reusable library. It defaults to generating the app with TypeScript, but then it makes it so that it's publishable. Yeah, you can use things like roll down or roll up. I think roll down is still in development. Those specifically are for like bundling. Let me see what I used, because I forked a project that created a Prisma plugin, and it had a good structure and flow. Because the nice thing about setting it up in a mono repo is, especially if you're like creating a component library or creating a library of functions that need to be imported, if you set things up in a mono repo, then it allows you to basically like test your own library inside of like a sample app, because then they both live inside the mono repo, but you're really just publishing the library itself. But then you have a test repo that can access it and try it out. Yeah, I think in my listed project, I specifically am using a Prisma plugin. Yeah, Prisma ERD generator markdown. So I forked another plugin and then rewrote a Prisma plugin that generates a markdown entity relationship diagram. But the library that I've forked was like using this thing. Okay, so you can see it's set up as a mono repo. I have my packages folder. And then let's see what I have in here. Yeah, and then I guess there are other things that you would want to include in a library, like if you use things like conventional commits, that's a whole standard for how you set up your commit messages. But if you do it in that way, then you can also make it so that when you create a new release for your library, it takes all of the commits that have happened since the previous release and creates a change log. But because your commits were written in a conventional way, it's able to do that. Let's see. Did I have anything beyond that? Because yeah, I have the generator package, and then semantic release is another thing you're going to want to use. Because this handles making sure that you set the right version, and then like bumping the version and releasing it, and then also using some conventional commits, fully automated version management, and package publishing. This is definitely one place to look and start when you're creating a library. You would have to use this in combination with the other strategies I talked about, like using like a mono repo. But this also would allow you to have a mono repo with multiple packages, and then each of those packages could have a different version and be published separately to npm. And so semantic release is going to help you with that. Let's see what else I was using. Yeah, and then you can see my semantic release configuration here. Cool. I guess that's mainly it. Yeah, the other cool thing, so I do believe, honestly, I should see where I forked this from. Oh yeah, okay, so create Prisma generator allows you to generate a plugin, but are they using anything specific to get all of the setup? Yeah. And Paolo is saying, I'm 100% on the change set instead of semantic release. I'm not familiar with it. I think anything that makes your changelog easier to generate. Introducing change sets. Simplify project versioning with semantic releases. Cool. And so this has a focus on mono repos. Yeah, I would say check this one out too. TSDX is what Ahmed is mentioning. Publish modern TypeScript packages. So yeah, this would allow you to create a TypeScript package, and then they have like a React template, which I'm guessing would allow you to create like a React component library. Cool. Check this out too, because this would basically be like full featured. It sets up the whole project for you. Cool. Yeah, and Scott is mentioning that it's good for React too. Cool. So hopefully that helps. Ultimately, mono repo, some kind of version creation and release tool, and then you're probably good to go from there. Because the main issue is, especially like if you're writing your code in TypeScript, when you publish it to npm, you need to publish the built code. And so if we take a look at this specific library on npm, and we look in the code, all that was published is the dist directory, right? So the actual code for that package lives here, and it has a source directory and then like all of my source code that are TypeScript files. But the actual thing that gets published is a dist folder that in turn has JavaScript files, because that's what other people are going to need to import into their applications. It looks like my build process doesn't generate TypeScript types, but you could include that, because that's another aspect of it, is you would want to distribute JavaScript code, but you would also want to include TypeScript types. And so your build process should be able to handle that. And so that's part of the release strategy, is that it needs to be built, and then when we publish it, we're specifically publishing that built folder. Yeah. Cool. All right. Yeah, great. Let's answer one or two more questions, and then I am going to get out of here. Isaac asks, is it possible to host React and an Express app on a single server? Client-side React, yes. And the way you would configure it is you would configure your Express app to statically serve the built React files, and then React could be served from the root of that Express app. And then you could have all of your API routes, and those would be prefixed with like /API. That's definitely possible. Combining Express with something like Next.js is a lot. I don't even know if that's possible because Next.js has like its own runtime. And typically with something like Next.js, you're defining all of your API routes within Next.js. Yeah. So yes, it's possible if you have a completely client-side React app. Basically, it just needs to be built and then served from the public folder. And then if you're using client-side routing, you potentially need a request handler that rewrites requests to the index route. Because if you're using something like React Router and then you have a nested page like admin/settings, if someone goes directly to that URL, it would potentially 404. So you need to redirect the request to that page, to your index page, which then kicks in the React app. And there's plenty of blog posts online that show you how to do that. Amado is asking, do you recommend tRPC to share types between the backend and frontend, or do you use another thing to do that? I think it's a good solution. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but if the client for your tRPC backend is TypeScript or is JavaScript, it makes a lot of sense. But if it's like a mobile app or something like that, it's a little bit harder because tRPC is like a specific protocol. It's technically happening over REST, and there might be client implementations that have been built for like iOS or Android, but it's not the default thing. So if your front end and back end are in TypeScript, it's a good way to go. But depending on what you're using to build, it might already have something built in. Because earlier we talked about like with SvelteKit, you can get full stack TypeSafety just using their data loader and data loading patterns. And then like with Next.js and React server components and server actions, you can get full stack TypeSafety by using those server actions because the types flow through there as well. So you may not need to reach for tRPC, but if you plan on having a separate API and like front end, tRPC makes a lot of sense then. Yeah. Oh, TSDX was made by Jared Palmer. Cool. Yeah, and I would also recommend, depending on the kind of library that you're trying to create, search around to see if somebody has a template. So for example, Cephadine found Vue component lib starter. So if you're trying to write a Vue component library, you could use that, which has been pre-configured for all of that. Yeah, and they just mentioned it's a quick Google search, but I think for anything that you're trying to create, you might be able to find something. Cool. Yeah, and I missed Ched's goodbye, but see you later, Ched, if you see this later. All right, I'm gonna get out of here. Thank you so much for all the questions and everything. I really do appreciate you all. I'll try to do this again at some point soon. It's fun to just hang out, talk and such. And I think next time maybe I'll gather questions that I get soon. I'll gather questions that I get on Twitter and maybe have some like code repos and code examples for you. Because today was a lot of talking, but I also like to show code examples sometimes too, but it's harder to do live, harder to set up live. But yeah, thank you so much for hanging out. And I'll remind you that we have a giveaway over on Instagram. So we just reached 30,000 followers. So if you want to enter the giveaway, see this post, leave a comment, you could win some syntax swag. But if you don't want to worry about winning, you also could just go to the store. We have a bunch of swag for sale, including this shirt and a few others. So if you visit century.shop, check it out. Also, follow us on YouTube if you're not. If you're watching on YouTube, maybe you already are subscribed, but if you're not, subscribe. I post videos. The podcast comes out 3 times a week. And you want to know when that stuff happens. So definitely subscribe over on YouTube. And that's all I have for you. All right. Thanks everyone for hanging out. Thank you for your questions. I will see you very soon.